Hi everyone, I'm Kwa Yi-Ling, a senior lecturer and convener of culture and society at Western Sydney University. So Yi-Ling is my given name. I would first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, Darak Yora, Darawa, and Wiradjuri people. It is upon their ancestral land that Western Sydney University is built. I wish to acknowledge their sovereignty was never ceded and the land we're meeting today remains stolen and occupied. I wish to acknowledge my privilege, responsibilities, and complicity as a migrant living and working in a settler colonial system that continues to perpetuate injustices and inequalities against First Nation people. I would like to pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the culture, and hopes of Indigenous Australia. I would also like to extend my respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present here today. Now, this is our second seminar. Radical Anti-Racism Today is an online seminar series curated by my esteemed colleague, Professor Alana Latin at the Culture and Society Discipline, Western Sydney University. And this is the second seminar of the series. Today, we are joined by US-based authors, Charisse Burden-Stelly and Jodi to discuss their book, Organized Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writing with Andrew Brooks. Now, the book Organized Fight, Win is the first collection of its kind that brings together 3 decades of Black communist women's political writings. In doing so, it highlights the link between communism and Black liberation. Likewise, it makes clear how Black women fundamentally shaped and were shaped by communist praxis in the 20th century. Now, Charisse Burden-Stelly is an associate professor in African American Studies at Wayne State University and a critical Black studies scholar of political theory, political economy, intellectual theory, and historical sociology. Jodi is professor of political science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. She has written and edited 13 books, including The Communist Horizon and Crowds and Party. Andrew Brooks is lecturer in media cultures in the School of Arts and Media, University of New South Wales, Australia. His research proposes strategies for reading and listening to contemporary media events, systems, and infrastructures. So we are really, really privileged and honored to have the 3 of them in conversation today to discuss this new book. So I'll just hand it over to Andrew to lead us in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Yi-Ling and Alana, for the invitation to be here. It's really lovely to be here this morning. I'm joining from unceded Wongal country, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And it's really wonderful to be here talking to Jodi and Charisse Burden-Stelly about this fantastic book, Organized Fight Win. I'm really excited to dive into it, so I won't take up any more time, and I'm going to get straight into the questions. So to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about how this collection came together? It is an edited collection that pulls together writings by Black communist women in the United States. Why was it important to collect these writings, and why was it important to collect them now?
So before Jodi goes into, she'll start off. We just like to always start our presentations reading the names of the women we've collected in this volume, so we can lift up their work that we are building on. So we have Ella Baker, Carlotta Bass, Dorothy Burnham, Liliana Burrows, Grace P. Campbell, Alice Childress, Marvell Cook, Esther Cooper Jackson, Thelma Dale Perkins, Tyra Edwards, Vicki Garvin, Yvonne Gregory, Lorraine Hansberry, Dorothy Hunton, Claudia Jones, Maud White Katz, Louise Thompson Patterson, and Eslanda Good Robeson.
Great. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we got the book together. It actually came out of teaching. So I'm going to step back just a little bit even before the teaching story. So Charisse and I met first at a event called Red May in Seattle, and I got to know her work and then invited her to speak at HWS, Hobart William Smith, where I teach. And so I knew that she had this really strong knowledge of the archives of of 20th century American communism, and 20th century, particularly the work of Black organizers and Black scholars in and around 20th century communism. And so I was teaching a course on socialist feminism, and a student was writing a paper and then told me, well, she couldn't find this particular text by Louise Thompson Patterson. And I'm thinking, oh, lazy student, that should not be so hard. Louise Thompson Patterson is completely important. This has got to be easy. And so, tap, tap, tap. Well, I can't find it. And then even with a little bit more work, I can't find it. So I contacted Charisse because she's got so many archives, and she didn't think it was going to be an issue too. And then sure enough, it's not there. Like, she doesn't have it. And then she starts reaching out to people, and then we start to realize this is ridiculous. It should not be this hard, right? It should be the case that these important texts are available in a volume that students can use, that activists can use, that scholars can use. And so that was the kind of germ of the idea. And then COVID happened, and I had time, she had the knowledge, and then I had an in-house research assistant because my daughter had to come home from college. And so it's like, we have someone to do part of the work. And, we had a lot of time on my hands. So that's the way it came about.
I love that. I hope my daughter in a decade's time desires to be involved in research like this.
Oh, I'll just add two things. One, we did pay her, so it's not like she was totally unweighed. But what was so exciting is that as she would get really like cool lines, because she had to transcribe it, most of the pieces were like on kind of microfiche copies, and librarians would send them to us as PDFs, but we had to retype them for them to be in manuscript form. So that's what Sadie did. And when she was typing particularly cool things, she'd like put them on Twitter or put them in her different social media, and she's snapping and so excited. And so it was really wonderful to see her enthusiasm about, and just like how radical and exciting these writings from 40 years ago, 50 years, actually more than 40, like 60, 70 years ago, like they remain so fresh and inspiring. And so it was also really exciting to see during the putting together process.
Yeah, and having spent some time with this book, I can tell you the writings do remain incredibly fresh, and it is really wonderful to see them brought together in one volume. It is an incredible resource for activists and scholars alike. So really wonderful to hear a little bit about the origins of that. So before we turn to the question of communism, which sort of haunts the title of this book, can you speak a little bit about the role that the dynamics of racialization play in the capitalist mode of production? Or in other words, how has race evolved with capital from its origins in primitive accumulation and the traffic in slaves through to the present day? I know that's obviously an enormous question, so I wonder if you might speak to that somewhat briefly, and in particular to think a little bit about the way the exploitation of racial difference has come to bear on Black women in particular.
Sure. So obviously there's like a large body of scholarship on racial capitalism, which is sort of what you're asking about. And then there's sort of two major camps. One is like the Cedric Robinson camp, and one is the South African camp that includes people like Martin Legasic, Bernard Magubani, and a bunch of others. But the basic way that I think about the sort of coterminous development of processes of racialization and capitalism is sort of, where do the realities of expropriation, plunder, violent dispossession, and super exploitation accrue? So there's a sort of base level exploitation of workers in general, like in the capitalist mode of production, right? But then there are those around who a particular form of extraordinary violence and extraction accrue, and those tend to be folks who are racialized. And racialization is bound up in colonization, right? So the way the world is ordered both racially and in terms of colonization, and colonization is the political enunciation of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, right? And so when we talk about racial capitalism, or the way racialization impacts capitalism, what we're doing is looking at who are the most sort of enduring sufferers, and how is that suffering legitimated to the end of sort of super profit, right? That is, that's the most basic way to explain it. But I do want to read this piece, or a little bit from this piece by Liliana Burrows, from July 30th, 1930, where I think she illuminates how race, particularly anti-Black, like racial oppression, operates. And so she writes that in woman and child labor in the colonies, through slavery, the Negro group has been scattered from Africa and the Eastern Hemisphere to both continents and the islands of the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere. In capitalist countries, this proletarian mass is at the bottom of economic scale. In the colonies, they are subjected to such ruthless exploitation as baffles description. Imperialistic greed pays such miserable wages to Negro men and women, and children also are forced to work. She goes on to say that working conditions for colored women are extremely bad. Employers in America make little provision for the health, comfort, or decency of their workers. In communities where there is protective legislation, it is often violated in the case of these workers. Many sections have no legislation. Safeguards for women workers are lacking in the West Indies. All the African colonies have a large body of labor regulations. That part which protects the worker remains a dead letter for the most part. Throughout the colonies, the other part, which penalizes the laborer for any infraction and regulations, is rigidly enforced, and on and on and on. And she talks about the violence to which African workers are subjected. And then she goes on to talk about how forced labor, expropriation of land, terrible living conditions, high death rates, child labor, the withholding of education, and negative legislation are all constitutive of the realities of racialized workers. So it's over and above the sort of baseline form of exploitation. This is what we mean when we talk about super exploitation. And so that's sort of how we can understand how racialization sort of reconstitutes itself, right? It's not static. Different groups are racialized all the time. Very seldom are they de-racialized. We do see that with sort of white ethnic people in the United States, for example, over time. But it's precarious and it's reversible. So so that's how I would answer that question.
Great, thank you so much. And I think this kind of, you ended here with a kind of like a long list that we find in that text of examples of super exploitation, forms of exploitation over and above the baseline, as you just put it then. And the writings, I think, that we find in this volume articulate visions of communism that respond to and redress and try to intervene in that kind of super exploitation. So the writing collected here it's extremely wide ranging. It attends to the everyday concerns of Black women, the role of the courts in the reproduction of racial inequality, the specific forms of exploitation faced by Black women, both at the hands of bosses who deploy racial difference to fracture worker solidarity, and also within the working class itself. I think that's a kind of important component of this text. We see that kind of very important critique of the reproduction of racialization from within the working class too, as well as the ongoing violence of white supremacy in the form of extrajudicial and or state-sanctioned violence. And then the book also connects these sort of more local concerns to internationalist ones, the threat of fascism abroad and within the US, the centrality of racialization to the extraction of surplus value across the capitalist world system, and so on. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the visions of communism that we find in the writing collected in this book. And in particular, can you speak about how these visions of communism relate to the abolition of racial and gendered forms of subjugation? And finally, might you say something then to the way that these forms of organizing and campaigning, or the way that this communism relates to forms of organizing and campaigning that unfold at the kind of local level?
Whoa, that's a huge question with a whole lot to unpack. So maybe I'd like to just maybe kind of pick and choose little bits and pieces, and then we can go back around to the parts, for the different parts. Like one of the things that when I hear and read the question is, I worry that it suggests or implies like a kind of here's a utopian model of communism, that here's the vision, and we're going to organize people by saying, oh, look, everybody, here's this promised land of utopia that we can see. And that's actually not the way. And I'm not saying that you're implying that. I just worry that like the language could imply that. But I think there's something much more sort of grounded than like, here's the vision of some, you know, far off future. Instead, there's a grounding in the struggle for freedom, a struggle for equality, and the realization that to have freedom and to have equality, you have to have unity and solidarity. And those kind of connection, but there's a connection between the aspirations for, you know, liberation and equal liberation and into oppression and exploitation, and the need for unity and solidarity to get there. So to my mind, there's something really practical and tied to concrete struggles that animates every bit of this writing. But that doesn't mean that it's like horizonless, right? There is a horizon that is a world without, you know, without exploitation, without oppression, an oppression-free world, whether or not that oppression, I mean, of any sort. And there's a little passage in one of the pieces that I want to read, and it's not about communism exactly, though it's clear when we hear it that communism is necessary for it, because it's a vision of peace. And the idea is that as long as there is capitalism, there is imperialism. And as long as there is imperialism, there is race oppression and white supremacy. And so we've got all of those things have to be defeated. And in fact, as long as there is imperialism, there's a risk of war, in particular in the age that by the writers at the end of the book, you know, nuclear war. And there's an active peace movement that they're intervening in. So, but I want to read this passage from Alice Childress, and we have two short pieces by Alice Childress that are the only pieces of fiction in the book. We had a long discussion, back and forth. Maybe I think probably it's fair to call it months, of figuring out, you know, do we want to? Because there's so much creative work, right, that could be included, and do we want to include poetry, and do you want to include memoirs, do you want to include plays or fiction? Because and then we decided at the end of the day that there's so much that this volume would need to be nonfiction, and primarily speeches, reports, articles, those kind of nonfiction policy, you know, struggle-based interventions. But because Alice Childress's columns were so important for Black working class women as an access to, you know, what it is to think in a, you know, a radical left communist way, that we have to include these. These are really important. So here's a little passage that I think gives us this sense of what communism, the vision of communism that infuses this book. But here she's talking about it as peace and as justice. What is its definition? You see, Marge, to me, peace means a lot more than not being in a war. It means peace in your heart and mind. It means my neighbors and friends and all mankind growing in wisdom and love and understanding. It means finding a cure for cancer. It means feeding the hungry, making garden apartments out of the slums, stopping polio, opening up every school in the land to all races. It means friendship and laughter and freedom from fear. It means grown-up folks not being ashamed to go to school and learn to read and write and enjoy this big, beautiful world. It means making it the social rage to belong to the millions rather than the 400.
Thanks so much. That's such a beautiful and very powerful passage. I think a really wonderful way of kind of restating and rephrasing the idea that that horizon is one in which we'll have access to the things we need to live and also to thrive. So that's really beautifully put.
Sorry, one thing I just wanted to add it quickly about like the organizing on the local level. I think that what the focus on Black communist women really opens up is sort of, it moves us away from some of the debates that have really infused communist historiography about, for example, the role of the Soviet Union and whether or not Black people or Americans were dupes of Moscow. That's really not the point. And it's not to say that these Black communist women were not engaging those debates. Some were, some weren't. Some left the party at different historical moments, some stayed, but they're doing practical work. So they're organizing around the Scottsboro Boys. They're organizing around Rosalie Ingram, a Black sharecropper woman who was sentenced to death, and then it was commuted to life for killing a white landowner. They're organizing in the 1930s again, like the Harlem Tenements League, so against evictions. They're doing really practical work, but then they're linking that work up to internationalist struggle. So they're linking Scottsboro to the invasion of Abyssinia in 1935 and to the Spanish Civil War. People like Louise Thompson Patterson even go to Spain to either fight in or document the Spanish Civil War. They're connecting fascism in the 1930s to Jim Crow in the United States, and then in the process coming up with their own theorization of an endogenous form of US fascism. And so the other thing I don't want to do is just reduce them to the organizing. They're also theorizing. So something that Lewis Gordon talks about, so when we think about the Cartesian split, right, the mind-body split, Black people are often reduced to the body. Like, we're considered to be people who do things and who act, but aren't necessarily developing theory per se, right? But these women are theorizing. They are, and it's sort of grounded theory, but they're developing, critiquing, and revising ideas as they're doing this practical work. But what they understand is that the way that we move toward the communist horizon that Jodi described is through satisfying the local material conditions with a broader eye toward how the many resolutions of material conditions, wherever they are very much linked, and that they have to sort of be in tandem. And that's where the party form, right, comes into play. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. That's yeah, really, really fantastic. And we'll maybe return to that question of the party form in a moment. But before we do, I wanted to ask a little bit about the kind of chronology of the book. And it is ordered chronologically. It tracks the writings, theorizing, and organizing of Black women from the 1920s over roughly the next half a century. And that chronology offers a really, I think, important kind of historicization of this movement in ways that allow us to track the kind of waves of anti-communism that have also unfolded over the 20th century and that endure in the kind of legacy of the Cold War. So I wanted to ask, and I will, I'm going to read a sort of like a passage from your introduction here that speaks to this, the kind of Red Scares and these particularly acute moments of Red Scare. The first in 1919 that occurred in the wake of the Russian Revolution, and as you write in the introduction, emanated from a slew of anarchist bombings and anxieties about Bolshevism, intensified by rising labor militancy and the Seattle general strike. That also combined with nationalism, anti-Germanism, and anti-immigrant sentiment in the wake of World War I. And then you go on to note that this first Red Scare corresponded to a related Black Scare in which Black soldiers returning home from the war and Black workers occupying white jobs in industrial centers encountered savage white mobs. During that violent Red Summer of 1919, Black people resisted white terror, fighting back against race rioters and lynchers. Instead of acknowledging justified Black outrage, white newspapers blamed the Bolsheviks and outside agitators for inciting revolt. That's the end of the quote. The final sentence here bears a striking resemblance to the way the George Floyd Rebellion was framed by mainstream media in the wake of the long hot summer of 2020. And then you go on in the introduction to identify, of course, the next acute Red Scare being the Cold War McCarthy era, in which a kind of rampant paranoid fear of communism took hold of the US and large swaths of the developed world, and which has cast a long shadow that we're still very much living under. And here I'll quote again from your introduction. Despite, during this second Red Scare, state repression damaged the lives of thousands of people. Communists were arrested, imprisoned, and deported. Anti-communism knit together and intensified anti-Blackness and anti-foreignness and justified the violent repression of Black political leaders. Because anti-colonialism, the peace movement, and desegregation were construed as dangerously un-American, leaders of the Black liberation movement came under particular attack. And now I think we find ourselves once again in a heightened moment of Red Scare. We can kind of think about this through the attacks on things like wokeness, gender difference, and in particular attacks on trans people, attacks on Black and Indigenous resistance movements, and of course the sort of like catch-all and ill-defined and poorly understood categories of cultural Marxism and critical race theory. Contemporary anti-communism then reproduces the fear of racial difference and foreignness and combines it with class hatred and an attack on gender difference. What then do these writings show us about the production and endurance of anti-communism as that which structures liberal politics? And how does attention to historical anti-communism allow us to understand its continuation and aggressive resurgence in the present?
So I do want to point out, so there's in, common historiography, there's like the first Red Scare and the second Red Scare. But if you read people like Robbie Lieberman, and then part of, I think, what my work on the Black Scare and Red Scare does is sort of, the Red Scare is, it's really ongoing, right? And so, for example, there actually is a period in between the Cold War and 1919, and this is the 1939-1940 era. That's kind of actually the second Red Scare. We're periodizing them in that way. And this was after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. And here in the United States, this is when we saw the passage of the Act to Prevent Pernicious Activities, or commonly known as the Hatch Act, which was passed in 1939, the Anti-Propaganda Act of 1940, which was actually a peacetime version of the Sedition Act of 1918 that obviously had been nullified after World War I. And that was commonly known as the Voorhees Act. And then the Alien Registration Act, which is the Smith Act, which is passed in 1940, which a whole slew of communists were indicted under starting in 1948. Well, prior to that was the Socialist Workers Party, but then the Communist Party was sort of decimated under the Smith Act. Also at that moment is when we start to see the decline of a really important organization, the National Negro Congress, because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So A. Philip Randolph did not like how members of the Communist Party, who are part of the NNC, advocated aligning with the Soviet Union and against, and anyway, so there was a factionalism in the NNC. But all of that to say, there was a Red Scare moment at that time, and then there was a sort of exodus at that moment from the Communist Party. And so I say that to say that, and it answers your question in the sense, because these Red Scares are ongoing, right? Because even in, we might talk about like a longue durée of McCarthyism, for example, that both precedes and exceeds the 1951 to 1954 moment. And even in the context of the Cold War, the 1947 moment is important. The 1951 moment, or the 1950 moment, which is the Korean War, is important. Then you have 1954, 1958, COINTELPRO, the shift from sort of Cominform to COINTELPRO. You have the Star Wars in the 1980s, and then the sort of battle of anti-communism shifts to Central America and the Caribbean. So it really is ongoing, and having an internationalist perspective, I think, brings that into sharp relief. We're seeing it today through sort of anti-China, anti-Cuba, anti-Venezuela discourse, anti-Nicaragua. And so, and then as you sort of mentioned, in 2020, there was a lot of this outside agitator discourse, when of course the primary outside agitator in that moment was Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Who literally came to Kenosha, I believe, and murdered people. He wasn't from there. He was an outside agitator. But then there was even, there was even sort of reports of China and, of course, Russia, like funding these Black people. Currently, we have the indictment of the African People's Socialist Party, which is a Black socialist organization that is basically being charged under the Foreign Agent Registration Act of 1938, which ironically was the act that W.B. Du Bois in 1951 was indicted under as an agent of a foreign power because of his peace work. So the APSP case is really important because it's not happenstance that they targeted a Black radical organization of all of the organizations. And this is a relatively sort of, I wouldn't say obscure, but it's not a huge organization. And the fact that they're targeted as basically agents of Moscow, not lead, and one of the first for sowing malign information and dissent in the United States on behalf of Russia, right? So that's another way that we see like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, so to speak. We see the ways that in the context of economic polarization, right? The rise of neo-fascism, the US empire in free fall, we see this return to, or this recapitulation of this anti-communist discourse as if communism or socialism are the sort of incubators of everything that's against American values, not least LGBTQ folks, women having bodily autonomy, racialized people existing, immigrants existing, right? And communism, anti-communism, because a sort of catch-all to merge these things together in an uncritical way. And it's so durable because it's very, very legible. The US has a long history of anti-radicalism, of which anti-communism is just one articulation, right? Prior to that, it was the anti-industrial workers of the world and anti-anarchism. This really dates back to 1798, the Alien and Sedition Act, which was a reaction to not only the French Revolution, but also the Haitian Revolution and fear about enslaved Africans in the United States being radicalized. So to make a short story long, that is why we are seeing a sort of resurgence of anti-communism and sort of familiar in new ways. So the cultural Marxism is the long history of like anti-Marxist thought, right? The wokeism, it's only new words for the same sentiments that were railed against the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, and the idea that not only was this, on the one hand, it was, Black agitation was rooted in foreign influence, but on the other hand, that educated Blacks were more susceptible, like Black leaders were more susceptible to these foreign or destabilizing ideas on the one hand, but then ignorant Blacks were also needed to be monitored and controlled because they were too stupid to think for themselves. So it's always, whether you're educated or you're uneducated, right? It really doesn't matter. And then this forces Black people to take on Cold War liberalism, right? To take on a particular position that is in support of imperialist foreign policy, or that is in support of patriotism to prove like their loyalty. And we see this happening, and it's actually probably even more acute than it was in the past because of the increased stratification in the Black community that has allowed for a particular managerial buffer class that is the but-for logic, right? They're American but for being Black, right? They think America's the greatest country in the world except for its racism, which is ludicrous. But so I think the last thing I'll say is that, so I said today on Twitter, actually, that, there's a bunch of liberals. American liberals are perhaps the most politically jejune group in the world. So they are celebrating right now, jejune, but they're not the most dangerous. But anyway, they're the most jejune because they're celebrating like Liz Cheney coming out with an anti-Trump ad, right? And so liberals are so quick to sort of race to the right and embrace right-wing folks who have some sort of convergence with one of their talking points. And in this case, like anti-Trump, right? But Liz Cheney's a complete dirtbag from a line of right-wing dirtbags. Her dad is Dick Cheney, right? And so what that conveys is how liberalism is amenable to fascism, precisely because it has always been more hostile to socialism than to fascism. And we see this happen historically. So in terms of this is how sort of anti-communism structures liberal politics, but also how that allows for these fascist upticks to happen over time. In our current moment, it might be more than just an uptick. So, yeah.
I just want to add, because I've learned so much from Charisse's work on this. I think of it kind of like, try to synthesize it as, liberals hate communists as much as conservatives hate communists, right? Hatred of communists is something that the liberals and the conservatives agree on. And the longue durée of anti-communism really makes that clear to us. Like, it really shows that there is a ruling class, and the ruling class is opposed to communists. And for this ruling class, what is the biggest danger to them? An organized working class. That is a working class that is not divided along the lines of race or ethnicity or citizenship status or sex or what have you, but they of course want a super divided working class. The biggest, I think that the just extent of anti-communism should just remind us that liberals don't like us. This idea that the left needs to cooperate with liberals all the time and make sure, people often talk to me about things like, communism, but shouldn't you just rebrand it? Like, what about a better term? But in fact, it's the hatred of communism, it's the distancing from it that unites the ruling class. And so keeping that in mind is absolutely crucial.
Thanks so much, both. I think, like, in both of your responses here, and Charisse sort of said it at the end of her response, there's a kind of relationship between anti-communism, liberalism, and fascism, and something you also alluded to there, Jodi. And so perhaps one of the things that comes through very clearly in this collection of writings is writings against fascism, and writings that are kind of naming various forms of fascism. And there is a common kind of idea, much like the kind of this idea of a kind of Red Scare periodization, that it happens in these acute moments, or that it's resurging. And similarly, we might kind of push against that, as you did in your previous answer, Charisse, and think about the continuity of fascism through the 20th century. I'm thinking here of a kind of question that Fred Moten and Stefano Hani ask us when they say, if fascism is back, as the common sense in Europe and the United States seems to insist, when did it go away? And of course, that kind of question is pointing to things like the kind of genocidal rule of settler colonialism, things like mass incarceration, but also the kinds of wars that have been waged against South American nations, covert wars by the CIA, apartheid rule across the world in places like Israel or South Africa. So we can see this real continuity of fascism through the 20th century. And the book very much collects texts that articulate communist struggle as a fight against fascism. They link the threat of historical fascist regimes such as Hitler's Germany or Mussolini's Italy to practices within the US nation state. As Claudia Jones writes on the right to self-determination for the Negro people in the Black Belt, one of the texts that's collected in the book. And I quote, "The main danger of fascism to the world comes from the most colossal imperialist forces, which are concentrated within the United States." So can you speak a little bit about how we might conceptualize fascism? And can you speak perhaps also to something that was present also in the kind of previous question, which is the casting of fascist ideologies and white supremacist ideologies in the role of the victim as something that's coming always under attack from communism, from Black Power movements, from struggles for from trans struggles and so on. What are some of the theoretical lessons that we learn from the writings of Black communists such as Claudia Jones, Thelma Dale, Esther B. Cooper that are collected in this book?
I'll do a short answer because I'm sure Charisse will have like a lot more to fill out. I think that the kind of short answer is it's first there's real active fascist when they're writing. And so, people who identify as fascist, like, black shirts, brown shirts, fascist parties. And so the one thing to keep in mind is that it's absolutely explicit that that there's a struggle between communism and fascism in the middle of the 20th century. That was the major issue. So that's something to keep in mind. It's not like an extension or a metaphor. And what's super important about the writings of the women that we've collected is that they recognize the US as having major characteristics of the fascist countries. Namely, the US is a power formation that builds white supremacy, male supremacy, and capitalism in an imperialist formation. Right? The United States is combining these things as well. It's combining these in a way to colonize the world. It's combining this in an imperialist and militarist form. It's dangerous to the world, particularly after World War II, when the war is over. And what is the U.S. doing? It's building the atomic bomb. So one of the interesting things about the U.S. is it is a country that had an apartheid racial formation in the South, an explicit race-based society. It was in the law. And yet the claim for World War II was that the U.S. was fighting for democracy. But at home, this was not what it had. So I think what are the theorization that is so important is to recognize, like, when you look at these pieces of fascism in terms of white supremacy, male supremacy, capitalism within an imperialist formation, that's the U.S.
To that, I'll only add warmongering and so warmongering is really important to the way that they theorize and understand fascism and that and anti-communism. So a foundation of fascism, as we know, the reason why the American business class in the 1930s loved Mussolini was because of the way that he beat back communists and socialists and disciplined labor. So I think that that's really important as well. And that part of what we need to what makes the United States fascistic, if not fascist outright, sort of over time, is that durable anti-radicalism. That's a foundational feature of Hitler's brand Nazism and the Mussolini brand of fascism, as well as Franco's Spain, right? The anti-anarchist and anti-socialist and anti-communist. And so because the US is such a deeply right-wing society, and it becomes more pronounced in the law really during moments of war like World War I, when you have the espionage and the sedition acts. And then during World War II, when you have the real hardcore use of the Smith Act. And then you have, in the Korean War moment is when we see the McCarran Act, right? And the really sort of the unabashed use of this anti-communist legislation. And so I think that part of what these women push us to see is, number one, how the treatment of Black people reveal the fascist-liked character of the United States. And number two, how anti-communism, so they talk about the Thought Control Smith Act, for example. They talk about the deeply racist nature of the McCarran Act, how it reduced immigration to the United States to just 100 people from the Caribbean. But as Claudia Jones says, they allowed these fascist scum from Europe to come to US in droves, but limited racialized immigration. that these are the things that we need to look at when we're thinking about the reproduction of fascism emanating from the United States.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wonder if we can kind of consider this question of kind of or build on this kind of analysis of the US as kind of you know, an apartheid state at home, and perhaps even to think about a kind of idea like Manu Karuka's that there is a kind of continental imperialism going on at the kind of foundation of the US. And he does in his book Empire's Tracks, he kind of makes this argument to think about the imperial foundations of US political economy, thinking about the relationship between military occupation, exclusionary border policies, and the kind of building of large-scale infrastructure projects like the Transcontinental Railway that involves the expropriation of Indigenous land. And in this volume, Organised Fight Win, we find the kind of writings of Black communist women theorizing, organizing in the US context. That theorizing and organizing is both local and internationalist, as we've already established, and they're very much responding to this kind of threat of fascism abroad. And yet there's not much engagement with the relationship between Blackness, communism, and indigeneity. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit to the absence of a kind of sustained engagement with the question of what it means to undertake communist theorizing and organizing in the context of a settler colony, and relatedly to how such discourse might have shifted since the 1960s, which marks the sort of temporal endpoint of this collection.
Yeah, I think that one of the large, probably oversights of like the Communist Party in general is a lack of engagement with the question of settler colonialism. A lot of that has to do, I think, with, well, there's a lot of contradictions within I think, the CPUSA that have a lot to do with there is a large white immigrant population that constitutes the CPUSA, and the conditions that they experienced here in the United States were quite different from those in Europe. And it did, in fact, represent an improvement in conditions. And this is also why, for example, they believe that the American Revolution is progressive, is an incomplete bourgeois revolution. So that is to say that's not necessarily an analysis that I would agree with. But I think that also accounts for the blind spot or the lack of theorizing around settler colonialism and indigeneity. It's almost like an acceptance of the fact that, you know, that project is complete, right, as opposed to ongoing. But I think that just like I think we can critique it, but, you know, it's a similar way to like how my students, when thinking about gender, will critique the lack of trans discourse in like the 1940s. It simply wasn't there. And so what we can do now is take that up and take it seriously. And I do think starting in the 1960s with the sort of American Indian movement, for example, and its sort of engagement with the Black Panther Party, there was a deep understanding of the relationship between Blackness and indigeneity and Marxism, Leninism, or Maoism, or communism, or whatever. And so I think that it's our sort of historical task to take that up now. And what's very interesting is that a lot of our friends on the left, as Gerald Warren will call them, a lot of our white comrades are not that keen to take up settler colonialism, right? Just like they're not keen to take up so-called identity politics in a way that, on the one hand, and on the one hand, it's because sometimes these discourses can lack a class analysis and can move into sort of a culturalism or an identity reductionism. But on the other hand, it can be a refusal to engage with expropriation, ongoing primitive accumulation, super exploitation, these things that we're talking about, which again is why a conceptual framework like racial capitalism, or why thinking about racialization, genocide, and dispossession alongside capitalist exploitation is really important. But, and I will say, they did talk about indigeneity, just not in the United States. They talked a lot about indigeneity and the treatment of Native people in Africa. So, which many, indigenous studies almost never accounts for indigeneity as something that is ongoing and a reality on the African continent. So.
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah. And thank you. It's such a great response, I think. Really important to think about how those struggles are connected and brought together. So maybe we have time for one more question before we kind of turn to, before I hand it back over to Alana and Eileen for questions from all of you who are here with us today. And so I might finish with a question about the kind of party form itself. These writings do tend to kind of organize themselves or kind of mobilize and invoke the kind of party as a way of thinking about how to organize and how to build responses to concrete local struggles, as well as kind of articulations for larger communist visions. And I'm wondering how you might speak to the future of communist organizing in a moment that might be kind of defined by the sort of hollowing out of the industrial basis of the capitalist core, by long processes of deindustrialization that have taken place over the last half a century that have resulted in economic stagnation, the shift of workers from kind of manufacturing jobs into, the dramatic rise in service jobs, including a dramatic rise in kind of under or un or precarious employment, and the weakening of kind of organized labor movements. So I wonder if you might speak a little bit to this kind of history of the party and a sort of how that figures into future organizing.
So they do organize. I mean, most of them are in the Communist Party. All of them are around the Communist Party. So they might be, but everyone has some kind of loose connection. Maybe it's part of the milieu. I mean, in the book, or maybe they're actual members. Those who are not members are still in organizations. Right? One of the things that's really common to every single one is the crucial nature of being part of an organized group, maybe whether or not that group is a union, whether or not it's the Communist Party, whether or not it's the women's group Sojourners for Truth and Justice, or any of the various sort of congresses and large-scale groups that they're part of organizing. So the first commitment is you can't struggle by yourself, right? To build power, you have to connect with other people and build unity. And one of the things that I find most helpful and inspiring about some of the writings is particularly those, I mean, there's a number of pieces that focus on organizing domestic workers. And one of the things that's interesting about that is domestic workers are not in industry. They're not factory workers. If we start thinking about the history of the Communist Party, like in the United States, as focusing not simply on organizing factories, but organizing domestic workers, it looks a lot different, right? If we start with the organizing efforts of people making tenants unions, people trying to organize to help their communities access relief during World War II. If they're organizing around community needs, if they're organizing domestic workers, then this fact of this hollowing out of deindustrialization shouldn't tell us, oh God, like some of the some on the left say, like, oh no, the unions are gone, the party form is obsolete. In fact, one of the things we now is see one of the reasons that we need to build even more. And this is one of the things that that they realized, is that you have to build the connections. They're not just going to be given to you by labor conditions, that you have to work across labor conditions. You have to bring people together. So, so to my mind, learning from the analyses and of trying to organize domestic workers is really crucial for party organizing now, because it's not dependent on the supposition of unions and the supposition of an industrial working class. It can work with a deindustrialized working class and a heavy service sector working class. And in fact, one of the things that we're seeing is more and more service sector organizing and its specific challenges.
Thank you so much. Charisse, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Perfect. That's a great place to end, I think, the kind of with some thinking about this future of organizing and how we forge those connections, how we conceptualize ways of coming together of shared ground. And that is a project, I think, that requires forging those relations, not just finding them. So thank you so much to both of you for the very generous conversation, for the really thoughtful and wonderful and rich responses. It's been a real pleasure for me to think with this book and to spend a bit of time with it and to learn many, many lessons from it. And I look forward to kind of thinking more with it into the future. I'm going to hand over to Alana and Yiling now, who are going to perhaps open this up for questions from the floor.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much to Charisse and Jodi for this incredibly rich conversation. I must say that from my perspective, what I loved about it was the ability of all of you to bring in so many different, both historical and contemporary issues and weave them through each other, because I think this is something that's really lacking in a lot of the kind of the focus on things that I'm interested, for example, around the so-called war on critical race theory or wokeism and all the rest of it, that treats it as a moral panic that kind of arises out of nowhere. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and there were two specialists in education, and they were talking about how they couldn't believe, from the perspective where they sit today, how they hadn't realized 10 years ago that this was coming down the line. But obviously, as Charisse was making the point, this is an ongoing and continual onslaught. There's really no break in anti-radicalism, be it in the US or indeed here in Australia. And I really love the connection that you drew there at the end, Andrew, to settler colonialism and indigeneity, and the point that you made, Charisse, about indigeneity in Africa, which I think is very often left off the agenda, as Robin D.G. Kelly has made the point, among other people. So that really makes it relevant to what many of us here are focused on today, putting critical Indigenous studies at the forefront, putting those who are struggling for land rights and self-determination and sovereignty on unceded lands at the forefront of these struggles, and connecting them in I think, perhaps in ways that, Debbie Bargali spoke about this at the last seminar, connecting them to workers' struggles, to which Indigenous people were at the fore, and maybe trying to think in various ways about how we can make those histories relevant again today. I think they are, but we rarely have the opportunity, I think, to discuss them, particularly in fora like this. So thank you very much. So my role now is to gather questions from our audience. You can do this in various ways. You can either raise your hand. I think it would be nice for everybody to see each other when we're talking together. Or if you feel more comfortable, you can also write down your question in the chat. So yes, over to you. It's always difficult to ask the first question, but there is a comment in the chat which I'll read out. Oh, Lynn has a question. Okay, let me go to Lynn first, and then I'll read out the comment in the chat. Thanks, Lynn.
Hi, everyone. Sorry I don't have my camera on. I'm in bed. I guess I just wanted to ask, I guess this idea that we've been discussing, especially in a US context, about organized labor as a means of resistance to fascism, And what we find in Australia is that organised labour and the trade union movement is so profoundly embedded in the mechanisms of state violence, what with cop unions, with detention guard unions, with screws unions, etc., etc. And so we actually have the situation when, we've got major unions going on strike to prevent, even minimal gestures of accountability when a screw murders, a black Aboriginal man. That's the sort of thing which goes on here. And so I know that there's some writing in a US context, like George Jackson, also regarding organized labor as potentially, or in actuality in the US, as a vector of deploying state violence and fascism. So I was wondering if you could speak to those contradictions, I guess, or challenges.
I'll start. I think that the capitalists win when we start saying that organized labor is the equivalent of cop unions. I mean, that just strikes me as a really losing propositions. That there are other unions, and that there can be unions of cops doesn't mean that all unions are bad, or that workers can do without unions. I mean, in the United States, the quality of life, the wages, the basic conditions of being able to support a household declined dramatically with the decline in union movement. I mean, how come? Like, I find it troubling to equate unions with cop unions rather than teachers unions or nurses unions or the organized workers of Starbucks. So I think it's a matter of organizing, of recognizing that that if the left abandons a sector, the right will take it over, and they'll take it over happily. And that the unions in general are too important to be left to the far right.
I guess I would agree, not to like jump back in. I guess I would agree with you there that they're not, that's not coextensive with the entirety of the union movement. I was just wondering if you could speak to what practical means of going forward with this are when the sorts of labour federations we have in Australia and I believe in the US, they're not equivalent to the cop unions, but they do include the cop and screw unions, and attempts to remove them over many years have failed again and again. And so I'm wondering if there are strategies that you can speak to going forward, or if we simply, I suppose, need to tacitly accept, in your view, given past experience, that enabling these vectors of state violence is simply part and parcel of the movements that we're going to be a part of.
Well, I think so. I'm a bad Marxist in the sense that I do not believe that white supremacy is a technique of obfuscation only of the working class. White supremacy is top down and bottom up historically. So I write this in my book, like it is historically top down and bottom up. Now, it is always to the benefit of the ruling class in terms of real material gains, but in terms of if we think about the psychological wage or the wages of whiteness or epidermal capital, those are things that white workers benefit from. And I think that unions are an objective good to the extent that they have an ideological orientation, that they have a progressive orientation. But if we look at something like the effects of Taft-Hartley and the disciplining out of communists and leftists from unions in the United States starting in 1947, there is a way that re-education of unionized workers really does need to happen. But I also think that what Jodi was talking about in terms of unionizing other types of sectors, which our Black women talk about, right? Unionizing domestic workers, unionizing contingent labor, which tends to be a different type or a different class of worker, is really important to like perhaps rethinking or reconstituting organized labor. But I mean, I'll be honest, like I'm really ambivalent about, so for example, in the United States, the Writers Guild is on strike, right? Which I think is really important. But these are the primary arbiters of propaganda and entertainment in the United States. So that's a real contradiction. It's not nothing. So on the one hand, I do think we need to support the Writers Guild, and we need to support strikes, especially because the Hollywood mode of production is what's being normalized throughout the United States. At the same time, that there has to be accountability for the nature of their work. Their work is it is problematic you know? And so I don't think these contradictions are arbitrary. You know, I don't think that they're unimportant. I think that they're very important, but I think it speaks to the failure of the left, or the potential of the left to really intervene in unions and intervene in these organizing efforts, so that it's not just about, or so that the ideological or the political foundation exists alongside the material gains, which, to Jodi's point, means that we cannot cede unions to the right wing, right? So you know, as a Black person, I think those contradictions are real, but it's not sort of impossible, right? Obviously, we named our book Organize, Fight, Win because we believe that we will win, and that organizing workers to the end of liberation, to the end of economic democracy is possible. But in right-wing settler colonies, it's I think we need to be more serious about the nature of white supremacy.
Thanks. That was really clear.
Yes, thank you for that really important question. And I was clapping when you were making the point about the Writers Guild, because I think that's absolutely, that kind of, you know, dialectical approach is really, really important when we try to make sense of these kinds of struggles and, you know, where they fit into, you know, to the wider struggle against white supremacy, which is what I think we're committed to. There's a question in the chat. Nilmini, did you want to speak this out loud? And there's also something from Sophie, or I'm happy to read them out. Nilmini?
I'm just out of bed myself and in my PJs, with my hair up in a wrap, so I won't show my face. But just to say, Charisse, I totally get you the different kinds of workers that we need to be thinking about. That the migration, a lot of migrant, even second gen, a lot of people of color, newly arrived, the children have grown up, they're not able to get work in, you know, major industry. There's a lot of racial capitalism and exploitation in the not-for-profit, so-called, which is really now called profit for purpose and so forth, a very unregulated sector where there is a huge amount of exploitation and absolute, pure, unbridled racism, gendered racisms and all forms of racism. So when we go to unions about things like that, especially in domestic violence, community services sector, where people are trying to access some funds for our communities, and that really has a really massive impact on the outcomes. And when we go to unions, when they go, well, I'm not a part of union, when they go to the union, it's very white and people don't understand race. So what happens there is nothing is done, there's no organizing, and it's very difficult to organize. So I just wanted to say thank you for raising that we need to actually look at other kinds of workers. We're still stuck in that mode of thinking the worker and the industry. These are industries too, in a way. So thank you, everybody.
So also just looking at this question in the chat along. So it's important to note, like I don't want it. So unions are important, okay? What is problematic about unions is people. People make up unions. Settlers, white supremacists, like white people who are, or all of us who are inscribed in the contradictions of any society in which we live, are what make any entity bad. We're academics. Academia is the intellectual arm of the state. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful about what our object of critique is, because we don't want to say, well, you know, I don't agree. It's the same type of sort of attack on organizations that we see by some of our anarchist comrades, right? It's not, or on democratic centralism. Nothing is objectively good per se or bad. It's the people that make it up, right? And so this is why part of the reason I'm writing about ethics right now, part of the reason so there's people who make up these entities. And so we can't like throw the baby out with the bathwater, even as we offer up these critiques. And so I don't want this to turn into like, you know, because settlers are in unions, because racist workers are in unions, ipso facto unions are bad. Well, no, because these people are everywhere, right? They're in universities, they're in churches, they're in school, they're literally everywhere. And so want us to hold both of those things together.
I do find that comment interesting. I mean, I think it's correct, but it also raises questions around what we mean when we talk about systemic racism, I suppose. People are in unions, people make up organizations, but they're also exist within systems which are difficult. I mean, it's that paradox, right? On the one hand, they have to be shifted by people, but on the other hand, people are formed by the context in which they find themselves, which in this place is a settler colony founded very much by people who advanced the idea of a working white man's paradise, based on the exclusion and dispossession of indigenous people, but also of non-white people until very late in the game. Does anybody else have a question? Oh, Jodi.
I just want to add in or draw from some of the analyses from I think the one I'm thinking of is from Thelma Dale in our book, but a number of our contributors or a number of the texts that we've collected are from women who were doing union organizing work. And one of the primary arguments that they raise is saying, look, the unions need to, the unions can't, I'll just use one example. They can't follow a principle of last hired, first fired, because what that means almost always is that Black women will be the first fired and then Black men. And that this is where it's necessary to explain to white workers why their overall interests are together with Black workers. Because if they don't completely defend the interest of Black workers, that will drive their wages down and there will be strike breakers. So what's so important about the analysis coming from these Black women union organizers is they're not worrying, they're not saying like, okay, I mean, they're addressing how the system is racist and using that as part of the analysis to convince white workers. They're not talking to the white workers about how they feel, but they're just saying, look, your interest is in making sure that your union is strong and you are defending these rights of the Black workers. And so they oh yeah, like Charisse says this really smart, right? The union and other institutions, their terrains of struggle. And keeping the practicality of how the struggle works in mind, I think helps a lot in these conversations, because it's sort of easy to, I don't know, like to just be completely abstract, as if we're just talking, as if everything can I don't know, it's almost like things are just like about someone's emotional attitude rather than what's the practical way to draw a connection to build power in this situation.
And I think that's a really important point. And so much of what passes as research on race and racism in this place is focused on racism as a kind of an attitude or a structure of feeling, rather than looking at structures of institutions and of the state. Does anybody else have a question? Ronita's saying unions are terrains of struggle, but they can also be terrains of institutional racism. Indeed. Anita.
All institutions are institutions of institutional racism if we believe our own analysis. That's what we mean by racial capitalism. So to say that, it's like saying water's wet. Yeah, right? What are we going to do about it? Right? And I also just want to say, I don't think that police officers have unions. They have like cartels. So I think that there's a difference between, they're actually not unions in like because they're not accountable to anybody, right? So I don't think they have unions in the traditional sense. They're just called unions to like obfuscate. But yeah, anyway.
Thank you. Anita has a question.
Hey, Charisse. I guess I was kind of thinking about the raising of, right, sort of how do we kind of, what do we do, right? And sort of kind of thinking about sort of changing hearts and minds, kind of changing people's like political analysis. So I was kind of curious about the women that you write about, if part of their local organizing was also around political education and like what were the kinds of work that they did around that, right? I was kind of thinking about the Claudia Jones piece in particular, just because I work in K-12 schools, and her point about kind of helping sort of parents, right, kind of like connect the sort of particular conditions at their local schools to kind of these like broader struggles. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Williana Burroughs was active in the New York City Teachers Union, and in one of the things that's important in some of her reports, which we got because of Minka Makalawi gave us the reports that he had gotten from the archives, and so I want to make sure he gets a shout out. Because we wouldn't have been able to include those pieces. But in her report, she also talks about strategies using forms of local education to try to reach out to people. So she's at least one example of someone who's quite conscientious about childhood education, reaching children, in part because of her own work as a teacher. All of them are in some ways educators, because they're writing, these aren't academic pieces. It's popular writing. Much of it is agitational writing. Some of it is analysis in parties' theoretical journals, but it's all written as a form of educating people to build solidarity and unity.
Yeah, just, something that Claudia Jones always points out in a piece that we didn't include, an Into the Neglect of the Problem of the Negro Woman, she talks about Black women as a potential force, right? And part of that is because they belong to like civic organizations. They're already organized, but in a sort of bourgeois form. So they need political education, right? So like there's no group that's objectively revolutionary just because they're women or just because they're anything, right? That ideology is important. And so she's talking about like the need to recruit them into the party for the purposes of political education. And also a lot of these women participated in some of the adult education schools. So like the Jefferson School of Social Science is like the classic one, right? Which is, they were free, it's political education. People like W.B. Du Bois, Lorraine Hansberry, et cetera, gave lectures at these adult education schools for the purpose of like political education. And so I think it's really important. And this is also why the sort of organizational or the party form is important, because political education is not individual study, like it's collective study. It's discussion, it's coming up with common language and vocabulary that can be, and that is linked to practical struggle. And so I think, political education is actually really foundational to even organizations like the Sojourners for Truth and Justice that aren't communist organizations proper, but they had like a lot of communist women who were in those, who are in that organization.
Thank you for that. We still have a couple of minutes for any other questions that anybody might have. Okay, possibly the early hour, and also a lot to absorb, I think, from all of us here. It's been so rich and so many things to think about. I really want to encourage everybody to go out and purchase a copy of Organize, Fight, Win. I believe that Verso has given us a discount code, which I'm going to email to everybody afterwards. All the participants, everybody who signed up for the seminar can get a discount code to get this book. I find it really, really useful as a teaching tool. So I'm hoping to include that in my syllabus for next semester on my master's course. And, I really encourage any other educators that are here to do so, because what I find particularly inspiring about this book is exactly what you said. So that these are not academic texts. They're texts that were written for quote unquote ordinary people to read and to use and to think about how to strategize. I was listening yesterday again, I'm a big podcast listener. So I was listening again to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism and their interview with two activists from Stop LAPD Spying. And they were talking about the importance of the combination of study and struggle and, how they use study groups and very often reading, public documentation, which they then analyze and put to use in the research that then drives their activism. So there's so much that can be done with these texts. And I think, being attentive to what you said, Charisse, the longue durée of this work. So not only the longue durée of the attacks against radicalism, but also the longue durée of the significance of these kinds of texts and how we continue to revisit them. And so I really want to thank you for bringing them to us in a sense. It's not, I suppose, that these texts were unavailable, but that for many of us, we were unaware. And so that's really important work that you've all done. So I'd like to briefly ask you to join me in thanking Jodi, Charisse, and Andrew for their time today. And Andrew, you did a lot of work in preparing all of the questions, and you all did a lot of work in answering them. And I'd briefly just like to put up a slide On the 14th of June, we're going to talk with Mahdis Azamandi and Garrick Cooper, and Yi-Ling is going to be in conversation with them about an edited collection that they're part of called Towards a Grammar of Race in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a really amazing collection of writings from different people who are involved in anti-racism and theorizing race in that context. So please join us then, 14th of June at 7 p.m. We'll also obviously be sharing all of this with you through our channels. Right, so thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, stroke evening, and I hope to see you all again very soon.